Imagine being born a princess, only to watch your mother executed by her father when you were just 2 years old. Imagine growing up branded a bastard, imprisoned in a cold stone tower, and told you would never rule. Yet against every plot, every betrayal, and every whisper that a woman could not command a kingdom, she did. She was Elizabeth Tudor. To the world, she became the Virgin Queen, a monarch who chose her crown over marriage, her people over passion, and in doing so, transformed England from a fragile kingdom into a global power. But how did a woman in a world ruled by men defy the odds for 45 years? How did she survive assassination plots, crush the might of Spain, and build a golden age that would outshine all who came before her? Stay with us, because this is not just a story of a queen. It's the story of survival, ambition, and the making of a legend. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world in 1533, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. For a brief moment, her birth was celebrated as the promise of a new dynasty. But in the eyes of a king who desperately craved a son, a daughter was a bitter disappointment. And Elizabeth's world would shatter before she could even form memories. When she was just 2 years old, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was accused of treason and adultery, dragged to the Tower of London, and executed by the blade of an executioner's sword. Imagine being a child, growing up with the knowledge that your father had condemned your mother to death. From that moment on, Elizabeth was branded illegitimate, a bastard in the eyes of the court. Her childhood was not one of fairy tales and gentle lessons, but of survival. She watched as her father cycled through wives, as her younger brother Edward became king, and as her elder sister Mary later took the throne. Each new reign was a storm, and in every storm Elizabeth was a target. One day she was a princess. The next she was a prisoner, locked in the tower under suspicion of treason, unsure if the next knock on the door meant freedom or the executioner. But from these shadows, a mind was being forged. Elizabeth learned early the value of silence, of patience, of reading the motives of men before they revealed their hands. She became cautious, calculating, and intelligent, not because she wanted to, but because she had to survive the deadly game of Tudor politics. She had to become more than a child. She had to become a player. When her half-sister Mary Tudor, remembered in history as Bloody Mary, ascended the throne, Elizabeth's life once again hung by a thread. Mary was a devout Catholic, determined to stamp out Protestantism from England, and Elizabeth, with her Protestant leanings and Tudor bloodline, became both a threat and a target. Soon whispers filled the court. Plots, rebellions, conspiracies. Many carried Elizabeth's name, whether she was guilty or not. And in Mary's eyes, even suspicion was enough to condemn. Elizabeth was seized, dragged to the Traitor's Gate, and thrown into the cold, damp chambers of the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had taken her final breath. For Elizabeth, it was a haunting reminder. The Tower was not just a prison. It was often a death sentence. Day after day, she lived in terror. The scrape of footsteps outside her door could mean her jailer or her executioner. Every sunrise was a question. Would she see another? Yet through fear, she mastered silence. Elizabeth did not protest. She did not beg. She waited. She read the currents of power like a sailor watching the tide, careful not to speak a word that could seal her fate. Her patience saved her. Over time, Mary's help began to fail. With no heir of her own, Mary was forced to confront an unshakable truth. The sister she distrusted, the prisoner she feared, was the only Tudor strong enough to inherit the crown. And so, in November 1558, the bells of London rang out with thunderous joy. Elizabeth, at just 25 years old, was crowned Queen of England. From a child marked as illegitimate, from a prisoner locked in the Tower, Elizabeth now rose to the highest throne in the land. But the crown she inherited was heavy. Her kingdom was divided, her enemies circled like wolves, and the shadow of her mother's fate lingered over her. Elizabeth had won the throne. Now she had to prove she could hold it. When Elizabeth claimed the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom on the edge of collapse. England was not one nation, but two, divided by faith. On one side stood the Catholics, loyal to the Pope in Rome, who saw Elizabeth as illegitimate and her throne as stolen. On the other, the Protestants, eager to push England further from Rome's grasp, demanding a church of their own. The air was thick with hatred, suspicion, and the memory of blood spilled during Mary's reign. Elizabeth knew what her people feared: another reign of fire and sword. Yet she also knew the danger of choosing sides. If she leaned too far towards Protestantism, Catholic powers like Spain and France would move to destroy her. If she bowed to Rome, she would betray the Protestants who had already shed blood in her name. It was a trap set on both sides. But Elizabeth was not her father, Henry VIII, who ruled by brute force. She was not her sister Mary, who burned Protestants at the stake. She was something far more dangerous: patient, pragmatic, and cunning. Instead of forcing one faith upon her people, she offered a middle way, a compromise history would call the Elizabethan religious settlement. In 1559, she declared the creation of the Church of England, Protestant in doctrine, but Catholic in ritual and appearance, a church that gave each side just enough to live with, even if no one was fully satisfied. When critics demanded to know the secrets of her heart, she gave them a line that would echo through history: "I will not make windows into men's souls." In other words, what mattered to Elizabeth was not what her people whispered in prayer, but their loyalty to the crown. It was a masterstroke. With one settlement, she calmed the storm, held her divided nation together, and secured her throne. England was still fragile, still vulnerable, but for the first time in years, it had a chance to breathe. For Elizabeth, wearing the crown was not enough. Every day, the question echoed in Parliament, in foreign courts, even whispered in her own chambers: when will the Queen marry? To her advisers, the answer was obvious. A husband would give her protection. An heir would give England stability. To the kings of Europe, her hand in marriage was the most coveted prize of the century. Kings and princes lined up to claim her. Philip II of Spain, once her sister Mary's husband, offered marriage to secure Catholic influence in England. Francis, Duke of Anjou, a French prince decades younger than her, dangled the promise of alliance, though Elizabeth called him her frog. Even closer to her heart was Robert Dudley, her childhood friend, the man many believed was her true love. Rumors swirled of midnight meetings, secret vows, and a queen who longed for more than a crown. But Elizabeth was not just a woman. She was a monarch in a world waiting for her to falter. She understood what few men around her did. Marriage was not simply love, but a trap. To wed Philip would make her Spain's puppet. To wed a French prince would risk war with Spain. To wed an English noble would divide her own court with jealousy and ambition. Every path was danger, and so she chose the unthinkable. She chose no one. She remained single, wielding her unmarried status as a weapon. With one suitor, she flirted just enough to win his favor. With another, she hinted at possibility, only to withdraw at the perfect moment. She turned her body, her hand, and her crown into tools of diplomacy, and by never belonging to a man, she belonged to her nation. Elizabeth began to style herself as the Virgin Queen, not a wife, not a mother, but a figure above earthly attachments. To her people, she was married to England itself. Her children would not be of flesh and blood, but of legacy, power, and glory. In an age when a woman's worth was measured by her husband, Elizabeth rewrote the rules. She proved she could rule alone, and in doing so, she became untouchable. If Elizabeth's reign was defined by survival, her greatest threat came not from Spain or France, but from her own blood, her cousin Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. To Catholics across Europe, Elizabeth was a heretic and a bastard, unworthy of the throne. To them, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, a Catholic monarch anointed by God himself. One queen ruled, the other waited in the shadows, and the stage was set for a deadly rivalry. Mary's life had been no less dramatic than Elizabeth's. Crowned Queen of Scotland as an infant, married to the King of France as a teenager, widowed young, and forced back to a hostile Scotland where politics and betrayal consumed her court. When rebellion forced her to flee, she crossed the border into England, seeking Elizabeth's protection. But Elizabeth saw the truth. Mary was not a guest. She was a threat. And so, Mary became Elizabeth's prisoner, locked away in castles and manors, guarded day and night. But captivity did not silence her. From the shadows, Mary became the beating heart of countless Catholic conspiracies. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally the Babington plot, all aiming to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Each plot uncovered tightened the noose, not just around Mary's freedom, but around Elizabeth's sense of safety. Elizabeth hesitated for years, torn between mercy and necessity. Mary was family, a queen like her, a woman who had suffered the same cruel hand of fate. But she was also a living symbol. As long as Mary breathed, Elizabeth's enemies had hope. And so, in 1587, after 2 decades of imprisonment, Elizabeth signed the death warrant she had long dreaded. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed, her head severed by an axe in a chilling spectacle. The decision haunted Elizabeth. She never rejoiced in her cousin's death, and for the rest of her life, she carried the guilt of condemning a fellow queen. But survival demanded sacrifice. And in choosing her own crown over her cousin's life, Elizabeth proved once more the ruthless truth of monarchy. To rule, one must sometimes kill the thing they love or fear most. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth's enemies no longer whispered in shadows. They prepared for war. At the heart of the storm stood Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, a devout Catholic. He saw Elizabeth not only as a rival, but as a heretic who defied God's will. And in 1588, he unleashed his fury. From Spanish ports sailed the Armada, one of the greatest fleets the world had ever seen. 130 warships, bristling with cannons, carrying 30,000 men, and blessed by the Pope himself for England's destruction. For Elizabeth, it was nothing less than a fight for survival. England's navy was smaller, her armies less experienced. Across Europe, many believed it would be the end of her reign, the end of Protestant England itself. But Elizabeth understood something deeper. The battle would not only be fought with ships and guns, but with spirit. As Spanish forces threatened invasion, Elizabeth rode to her troops gathered at Tilbury. Dressed not as a fragile monarch, but as a warrior queen, she delivered words that would burn themselves into history. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England, too. In that moment, she gave her soldiers not just orders, but courage. What followed was a clash of destiny. English fire ships broke the tight Spanish formation. Storms battered the mighty Armada, and the smaller, faster English vessels harassed their enemy until the invincible fleet was forced into retreat. By the time it limped home, half its ships were gone, thousands of sailors dead. The empire that was meant to crush Elizabeth had been humbled by a nation half its size. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was more than a military victory. It was a turning point in history, the moment England rose from a vulnerable kingdom to a rising naval power. For Elizabeth, it was proof that destiny was on her side. Against the might of Spain, against the weight of Europe, she had stood her ground and won. From the ashes of turmoil, Elizabeth forged more than stability. She forged a golden age. With the threat of Spain pushed back and her throne secured, England began to breathe freely, and in that breath came a surge of creativity, ambition, and pride that would echo through centuries. In London's crowded playhouses, the voice of a new culture was born. William Shakespeare gave words to the human soul, his plays capturing love, power, jealousy, and destiny in ways the world had never seen. Christopher Marlowe dared to explore ambition and tragedy with fire and boldness. Edmund Spenser wrote of knights, queens, and legends that mirrored Elizabeth herself as a living symbol of an almost mythical England. Under her reign, art was no longer just entertainment. It became the heartbeat of a nation finding its voice. But the Golden Age was not only written in ink. It was carved on the seas. Elizabeth's captains, Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and others, pushed the boundaries of the known world. Drake circled the globe. Raleigh dreamed of new colonies across the Atlantic. With each voyage, England's reach stretched farther, planting the first seeds of an empire that would one day span the globe. At home, the English people felt a new sense of identity. Once divided by religion and shadowed by fear, they now stood behind a queen who had defied Europe's might. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victory. It became a symbol, a reminder that this small island, guided by a woman many had doubted, could stand tall against kings and kingdoms. Elizabeth had given them something priceless, pride. This was the Elizabethan age, an era of poetry and power, discovery and destiny. Under her rule, England was no longer a vulnerable kingdom struggling to survive. It was a nation rising, dreaming, and reaching for greatness. By the dawn of the 17th century, the once radiant Virgin Queen was no longer the dazzling figure who had outwitted monarchs and defied empires. Elizabeth grew old in the shadow of her own legend. The glittering court that once sang her praises fell silent as her dearest friends and counselors, men like Sir Francis Walsingham and William Cecil, passed into the grave. One by one, the pillars of her reign crumbled, leaving her surrounded by courtiers who were younger, colder, and strangers to her glory. In the stillness of her chambers, Elizabeth turned inward. She clung to the memory of her youth, when she was strong, witty, and adored. She had ruled as a virgin queen, wedded only to her kingdom, but the price of that vow was solitude. With no husband, no children, no heir of her body, she knew the Tudor line would die with her. The woman who had given England its golden age would leave behind no son or daughter to carry her blood. Her final days were marked not by speeches or triumphs, but by silence. She sat for hours upon the floor, lost in thought, unwilling to lie in her bed, as though fearing that to rest was to surrender to death itself. Her courtiers whispered that their queen was consumed by melancholy, a shadow of the fiery monarch who had once stood unbroken before the Armada. And then came the words that captured the sorrow of her reign: "All my possessions for a moment of time." A queen who had commanded armies, poets, and explorers realized in her final breath that power could not buy back youth, nor defeat the march of mortality. On March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth I slipped away at the age of 69. With her death, the Tudor dynasty ended, and the crown passed to Stuarts. Yet though her body failed, her legend only grew. Elizabeth had reigned for 45 years, transforming England from a fractured kingdom on the edge of collapse into a nation that stood proud, feared, and eternal in its destiny. The Virgin Queen left no heirs, but she left a legacy. When Elizabeth I closed her eyes for the last time, she left behind more than a throne, she left behind an era. Her name became immortal. The Elizabethan Age, remembered as a time when England rose from a fragile kingdom into a world power. It was an age of Shakespeare's words, Drake's voyages, and a queen's unshakable will. Elizabeth became more than just a monarch. She was a symbol of strength, of independence, of a nation learning to stand proud. She had no husband to define her, no children to inherit her crown. She chose a different path, to rule alone, to belong not to one man, but to an entire people. And in that choice, she became something greater than a wife, greater than a mother. She became a legend that still lives on centuries later. Pause, then closing hook. But England's story did not end with her. For with Elizabeth's death, a new dynasty rose, and with it new struggles, new wars, and new ambitions. The Virgin Queen is gone, but what came next would shape the fate of England forever.